We're going to continue where we were before on page, I think, I'm going to say 17. Sorry? 26 and 27. And we're going to go, so for those of you who didn't make the first part of the talk, I'll give you a little background, only to tell you that we have covered the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. We've talked about some of the consequences of post-traumatic stress disorder, like substance use, some of the severe consequences of post-traumatic stress disorder, like suicide. And we're moving into some other areas that I want to address before we go into some real concrete things about veterans on campus. So what I want to talk a little bit about military sexual trauma, because when we talk about PTSD, so often in the press and so often in movies, we're talking about combat. Right? And certainly it's relevant to talk about PTSD when we're talking about combat. But when we're talking about trauma in the military, it's important to remember that trauma in the military, amongst many other things, also includes military sexual trauma. And what we're talking about with military sexual trauma is sexual assault or repeated, unsolicited, threatening acts of sexual harassment that occurred while the veteran was in the military. It's a fairly broad definition. And the numbers that we have, and I'd like to say that these numbers are fairly accurate, although I can't tell you for sure whether they've been underreported. I can tell you for sure that they're not overreported. So if anything, the numbers are higher than what's actually reported. But for women, we're talking about 15%. We have at least acknowledged experiencing military sexual trauma. I would suggest to you that for many women, the number is significantly higher than this, but they grow so accustomed to certain ways that they're talked to that they don't consider it traumatic anymore, and they probably don't acknowledge it. Most of the women veterans that I talk to, even the ones that don't consider it traumatic, will say, oh yeah, that happens all the time. It's part of being in the service. We talk about, in Iraq, there was a particular case where women were told by their base commanders that they were not to go to the showers by themselves. Right? Well, why is that? Because there's, even on the base, a fear that these things can happen. Okay? Now you look at the numbers and you say, okay, 15% of women, that's not so surprising. It's not a good number, but it's not a surprising number. What about 1% of men? Do men get raped in the military? Yes, they do. Do men get sexually assaulted in the military? Yes, they do. Someone often asks me, well, are we talking really about gay men? And the answer is no, not specifically necessarily. Sexual assault and rape is about power. It's about asserting power largely. It's about lots of things, but amongst other things, asserting power, which has nothing to do with gender and nothing to do with sexuality. So when we're talking about military sexual trauma, we're talking about misuse of power. We talk about assault. Okay, we get confused sometimes about the word sex, and I don't want that to be the case. So, okay, 0.7%, let's round it up and say 1% of men. What's really important to remember here is that 1% of men, if we think about aggregate numbers, is actually about the same number as 15% of women. It's about 60,000 people on each side. 60,000 men and 60,000 women have experienced, plus or minus, military sexual trauma. That's a huge number of folks. It's an important number for us to know at the vet centers and VAs in terms of the way that we make our clinic and our therapies available to people, the way we think about sensitivities, the way we think about who we include in our groups, the way we do simple things like drug testing and urine testing, for example, at the VA. One thing the VA will do, which I think sometimes isn't a good idea, is if somebody is doing a urine test, they might have someone in the room with them. Doesn't always work when someone's had a military sexual trauma. You're not really willing to do that. Is that a sign of not being non-adherent to treatment, or is it that this person really doesn't feel safe? Okay, so something to be aware of. Where I'm really trying to get to with this is not to turn you all into clinicians. Some of you are clinicians, but to make you aware of all of the possible things that people bring with them to campus that can be triggered or can be affected or can change their behavior in a way that makes them less successful on your campus. And oftentimes, and I was just talking to someone earlier, oftentimes all you will see is the behavior. You'll see a behavior that seems to not fit. A veteran won't tell you where it comes from, presuming they know where it comes from, which oftentimes they don't. And so you see a behavior that seems not to fit with the person that you know, and you're left trying to deduce where it comes from. So the more that you know about these things, the more power you have to say, wait a minute, I wonder if this is related to that. Maybe this behavior comes from a certain place, and that's something to be aware of, okay? Traumatic brain injury, often considered to be what we would call the signature wound of this conflict. Well, why is that? Why does it get that noble title, the signature wound of this war? Why, in particular, traumatic brain injury, do you think? Concussions, explosions, exactly. So one of the ways, obviously, we've all seen it on the news, one of the ways that enemy combatants have learned that they can at least have some success in asymmetrical warfare is through improvised explosive devices. And so what we're talking about for a lot of our veterans, we're talking about getting their heads knocked around in ways that our heads are not meant to be knocked around. Okay? And it having a whole host of diverse effects on people. I'm skipping a little bit because I know you have it in front of you, but at one point more than half of OIF injuries were due to blasts, with 29% of patients being evacuated for TBI, traumatic brain injury, or mild traumatic brain injury. Okay, it's a huge, huge, huge problem for veterans. Okay, and one of the reasons that it's so difficult for veterans is that the symptoms of TBI are very diffuse, they're not always consistent, and they're often very subtle. All right? So one of the things, so here's a list that you have in front of you of how, for example, TBI, mild TBI, and PTSD overlap. So all of these are symptoms that you might have. Here are the ways that they overlap. So if somebody comes in and they have headaches and sleep problems and numbing and feeling guilty and memory problems and concentration problems, and I mentioned this earlier, do they have PTSD? Yes, possibly. Do they have traumatic brain injury? Yes, possibly. Okay, and it's very hard for them to decipher that. And in fact, and I say this to all of you, especially instructors, it is often, particularly when it comes to traumatic brain injury, in a college setting or an educational setting, that our veterans start to discover that something isn't working well. Right? That maybe it was happening, but they just didn't notice until they went to class. And maybe they were a BC student or a B student in high school, and they come and they sit down and they're highly motivated, and they read your material, and it just doesn't get in there. It doesn't get in there. They don't remember it. They don't remember the last paragraph they read. They took copious notes. They don't remember taking those notes. And they do really poorly in your class, and they don't get it. They get really frustrated. And so sometimes and this is where it helps to be really aware, and this is true of other students, not just veterans, but since we're talking about veterans, where you notice that there's a huge gap in what appears to be the effort of the student and the results that you're getting. One thing to consider with veteran students is a mild traumatic brain injury. And you might say to yourself, well, if I had a mild traumatic brain injury, wouldn't I know? I would know, right, if I had an injury? No. You might not know because, and the red, by the way, is here are areas where it's really probably not PTSD. It's more likely to really be related to brain injury. So things like poor balance, dizziness, changes in vision, slowed or cloudy thinking, those kinds of things. But you may not notice those things. You may not be so aware of yourself, and if you haven't been a student for a long time, you may not realize that things are really different for you. For example, you look at this veteran. Does he look like he has traumatic brain injury? If you saw him on the street, if you saw him in your class or on your campus, would you look at him and immediately think, oh, here's a guy with significant TBI? You wouldn't think that. And yet, when you actually, this is a real veteran, if you actually look at his history, he barely makes it out the door because of his traumatic brain injury, because of the concussive blasts. And sitting in your class or a class is a huge endeavor for him because of headaches, because he feels uncomfortable. And it's a tremendous effort for him, but you wouldn't see it by how he looks. Okay, something really important to keep in mind. Before I head into this, I want to say, so one of the reasons that veterans don't always know about their traumatic brain injuries is you have to think about how those things might come about. So one example that I hear a lot is, Well, we have a list of questions at the vet center when someone comes that we go through, and one of them is, were you ever in a concussive blast strong enough to knock your helmet off or knock you down, or where you lost consciousness? And what guys will say is, oh yeah, that happened, right? Yeah, that happened. In fact, maybe it happened I had a guy it happened like 6 or 7 times. And you say, well, what did you do after that? Well, what do you mean, what did I do? I got back up, and what do you mean? I didn't do anything, right? And particularly if there's an ID or an explosion, there may be other people who were much more severely hurt, more severely wounded. And so this veteran, he looks around and he says, okay, I'm fine. He dusts himself off, puts his helmet back on, gets back in the vehicle, and goes back to his job. Does he have a headache that day or 3 days later? Of course he has a headache. Is he going to run to the medic and say, medic, I have a headache. I think you should assess me for traumatic brain injury? No. Maybe he's going to take some medication, but largely he's just going to do his job, and she's going to do her job and not really pay attention to what's happened until homecoming happens, until years later when you're trying to write an essay or trying to do that biology quiz, and you can't concentrate because of the distractions in class. Okay, so one of the ways that you can really help, I think, is by noticing how these things express themselves and actually asking, did you have this thing happen to you? If you're comfortable with this veteran, and if you did, would you be willing to have an assessment done? Would you be willing, either you guys offer it or the VA offers it, somebody offers it, would you want to check that out? Because if you did actually have this, there are things you could do to make your life easier. So don't necessarily assume that people know. I would say particularly when it comes to mild traumatic brain injury, people don't know. They may think something's off, but they don't know. So a day in the life of the student veteran. Here's an example that's not uncommon for the veterans that I talk to. You sleep very poorly in the night. You woke up in the middle of the night because you heard a noise, or you thought you heard a noise. Maybe it was windy, for example, and you heard something clank, and so you were up for 2 hours paying attention to that noise to see if that noise actually meant something important, and then your limbic system kicked in and you were really awake and you couldn't do anything to sleep and you just couldn't sleep. And then because of that, you had intrusive thoughts and you started having memories about the past, and that certainly didn't help you sleep. So then maybe you took some meds. Maybe the meds were prescribed. Maybe they were bought at the grocery store, those kind of meds, to finally help you sleep. You do, but by the time that kicks in, now you oversleep. This is really common, folks, some version of this almost on a daily basis. Now you oversleep. Uh-oh. Your perfectly designed plan to be out the door at a certain time to miss rush hour traffic, completely out the window. You're trying to get through rush hour traffic, which, by the way, totally triggers you. Just to get to class, you have to run to class because you're late. And if you're in the armed services, you don't like to be late. Okay? And also that way you won't be able to get your seat. So now you're in a little bit of pain. Your seat isn't available. You feel out of control because of the lack of change in your routine. You feel out of control because you're not sitting in the seat that you feel the safest in. So you're generally feeling pretty poor. You remember that it's an open book test today. But where's your backpack or your book, which you normally are very structured about? It's in your car, it's in your girlfriend's car, it's at home, whatever it is. And you feel like I'm totally screwed at this point. And you feel horrible about yourself because this is not how you see yourself. When you look in the mirror, you are a service member that takes care of business. You are squared away. You have been taught better than this. When you think of yourself in the military, you acted in a much more organized way than this. You were much more prepared. You see these other kids who are not prepared and can't stand to think that you might be like that because, of course, you have other things going on, but maybe that doesn't occur to you, and it's only 9 a.m. Okay, so for a lot of student veterans, these are the kinds of things that they contend with just to get to school, right? So just sitting down in your classroom between the time they went to bed last night and the time they were sitting in a classroom or standing in a line or waiting to register, all of these things or some version of these things could have happened before they talked to you. And so you say, well, gosh, I talked to a veteran, he was really irritable. Yeah. Yes, that's true. Here's why. And there could be lots of other things too, okay? So let's go into some things about returning veterans, specifically challenges on the campus. How does military culture, we heard a bit about military culture earlier. how does culture affect a student's learning ability? Well, if you were in the military, you may not be all too enthusiastic about asking for help. That may not be the way that you've been taught. Oftentimes in the military, you are taught to what? Improvise, adapt, overcome, okay? Be resilient. And so the idea, especially again, if you're older and you see these young kids in your classroom and you think, I should be able to take care of this. So you don't think to ask questions necessarily. Some people do, but oftentimes you don't. You wouldn't think to report problems because you feel like, I'm an adult, I should be able to handle this. What we see oftentimes in veterans coming back is they feel like they have missed out because they have been in the service, meaning that they're behind. They look at their peers who didn't serve in the military, they are farther ahead academically, they're farther ahead in their careers, and they feel like, I got to get there, and the way that I'm going to get there is I'm not going to take 12 units, I'm going to take 19 units. And I'm not just going to take 19 units of basket weaving and whatever else. I'm sure none of your schools offer that, but maybe it's a Bay Area thing. Well, I'm not going to take basket weaving. I'm going to take organic chemistry and physics and an upper division English class, and I'm going to try to cram that all into my first semester because I got to move. I don't have patience. I got to take care of this. And what ends up happening for some veterans is they're so pressured to get it done, get it done, that they get out a little bit ahead of themselves. They've got all these other stressors. They haven't been a student in 6 years or 7 years or however long it is, so they need some time to catch up in terms of their ability, and then the whole thing kind of collapses, right? And so that then creates more anxiety and shame. They don't want to come back, and then when they finally get it together to come back, now they feel even more behind, and so they feel like, again, the only way to go is you got to cram in all the units. And so I think there's some room here for those of you that counsel veterans and academic counselors here too, to kind of, where appropriate, say, okay, slow it down. Do what you can handle. You can't make it go faster than this, because now some veterans can do it. I'm not saying, I'm not trying to put a blanket statement, but having that conversation with folks can be a really important one, because sometimes that's what really makes the experience not successful, is just trying to do too much too fast. Feeling very offended when not trusted, right? Either not trusted because, for example, they forgot an assignment, they said it's in my car, or can I email it to you? And the professor says, well, how do I know that you're really telling me the truth, right? And the veteran thinks, are you kidding me? I was in charge of millions of dollars of equipment and 100 lives a year ago. And you think I'm lying to you about this homework assignment? Right? There's a real tremendous sense of being offended, of not being trusted. Are you kidding? I'm an adult. If I want to be here, if I tell you that I can, you should trust me, right? Don't treat me like a child. And so sometimes, from the professor's standpoint or from the school's perspective, well, we're treating you like any other student and these are the rules. But I think from the veteran's perspective, I remember I talked to someone once, they were a pilot and they weren't allowed to rent a car, right? Because they weren't 25, okay? So I can fly I don't know how much a F-16 costs, but I'm pretty sure it's more than a Hyundai, okay? Pretty sure, right? So that kind of discrepancy between the way that I was trusted and the way that I'm being trusted, the way that I was treated in terms of respect and maturity, and the way that I feel like I'm being treated now can cause a real rift for veterans if they feel like it's not being addressed appropriately, okay? Classroom peers we talked about not necessarily being able to relate, and vice versa. Making everyday decisions. You'll hear the student panel. Please don't leave until the student panel's here too. Making everyday decisions. Again, this lack of structure. When you're in the military, and I think that came on really well in the video over lunchtime, when you're in the military, you know what the next thing is. And more importantly, someone will tell you. Someone else is working out what the next thing is. You may not like it. You may enjoy complaining about it. That's sort of a pastime that I've noticed in the military, right? There's a lot of complaining, but at least you know it's being taken care of. Here, that has to be you. And it's hard to do that. Really, we talked about boredom. We talked about getting involved. I'm going to come back to. So some of the stuff we've touched on. Typical challenges on campus. Class assignments. There are some obvious ones, and there are some less obvious ones. Here's some obvious ones. Well, actually, even this isn't obvious. I actually taught a class, a psychology class at a community college in Oakland, and I had students do a dream journal, okay, where they write down their dreams. That is I think it's a great assignment. Students generally really enjoy it. You don't get graded on how good your dreams are, so it's sort of free points. Everybody likes that. But there's an opportunity here for someone to write down dreams that are really, really scary. And one of the things that I've heard happens, for example, is first of all, it can be really triggering for people who are trying not to pay attention to their dreams. And it can also scare the living daylights out of the instructor, right? Where the instructor says, well, I want you to write down your dreams. And the person writes down dreams that are, and oftentimes, particularly with PTSD, incredibly violent. That's how the dreams often are, PTSD. And it just scares the professor out of his mind or out of her mind. And the next thing they know, this person's turned in an assignment in good faith, and suddenly they're getting a referral, right? And that experience can be incredibly, what's the word I'm looking for, uncomfortable for a student. Here I'm sharing these dreams with you. You asked me to put it down on paper, I did. And now you're telling me there's something wrong with me, and I've got to, it's a really intrusive experience for people. So when it comes to things like asking to do dream journals, asking to do self-reflection papers, I know there's some things on the internet too with self-reflection papers where people say, okay, they'll say write about an experience. So they write about an experience, and it's a really bad experience. And then they're asked to read it in front of the class, and they read it in front of the class. And I had a vet, he did that. It wasn't a good idea for him to do that. He broke down in the middle. The class didn't know how to handle it. He didn't know how to handle it. The professor didn't realize that that was going to happen, right? And so as we make these assignments, it's important to be aware that if there are veterans in our classes, and there are, okay, that when we're asking people to do these things, to be really thoughtful about it and to have provisions and provisos and ways that people can do other things, right? Or to say something like, if you want to write about an experience that was really hard, and this isn't only for veterans, be really mindful about whether that feels safe to you or not. You don't have to write about that. If you're going to be talking in front of the class, and I had this conversation with the panel that you're going to see later, if you're going to be talking in front of people, maybe that's not the time to share something you've never shared before. In fact, I'm going to recommend that you don't do that. Okay? And sometimes people don't. They have an opportunity. There is a story that needs to be told, but it's not the place to tell it because it's not safe. Not because people shouldn't hear it, but because it's not safe for the person telling it. After it comes out, it feels horrible. It feels like they can't get it back. It's very chaotic and dysregulating, and it's just not pleasant. And so to be really aware of those things. Other assignments that you think are really benign turn out also to be difficult. So I have Hemingway up there. That's Hemingway, by the way. An instructor give an assignment for reading one of Hemingway's books. I think it was The Sun Also Rises. Yeah, which is partly about Hemingway's experience as a medic in World War I. And one of the veterans actually came to him and said, I really can't do this assignment. I can't write about this stuff. I really don't want to read about it. And the instructor's attitude was, and again, I'm not trying to demonize the instructor, except to say that I think he didn't understand. The instructor's response was, what do you want me to tell you? That's the assignment. You can drop the class if you want to, right? Those were the two options. And so again, from the instructor's perspective, he wasn't assigning a book about the Iraq War. It's a literary classic, well, regardless of how you feel about Hemingway, but it's a debatably classic piece of literature, and that seemed like a legitimate assignment. And from the instructor's perspective, that's what, you took the class. And so having some appreciation for ways in which assignments that are not directly associated with the war can also be really triggering for people. And the same is true of videos and DVDs and other things. In the same way, we also have experiences of, and some of the student veterans have talked about that, there are lots of places where discussions about the military, discussions about the war can come up organically in a class, right? I don't know why that would happen in an art class, as Dr. Thomas was saying, but there are ways, it could come up in a business class, for example, I've heard, right? You're in a business class and you're talking about, well, you're having a reasonable discussion about how Congress should cut the deficit and about economics in times of recession. and somebody gets up in the class and they say, well, the real problem is that we spend all this money on the military-industrial complex. Okay, all right, that's a legitimate position to take, I think. But there's a student veteran and a number of student veterans in the class, and they might respond or be thinking, well, wait a minute, what are we we're spending money on armor for my Humvee. That's not a theoretical concept. That's an actual thing that I was really glad to get, because when the war started, I didn't have that thing. I really like that we spend money on that. And if the veteran starts talking about it and we start getting into an argument and discussion about it, it's easy for that to go to a place that, again, feels really unsafe for the veteran. Okay? So you might ask, as an instructor, well, should I not have any of those? Should those be completely off limits, and somebody talks about something about the military and I tell them they have to be quiet? I don't think that I'm suggesting that. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that when those things come up, it's really important to be aware that those topics, even when they're discussed objectively or theoretically, for many student veterans are highly, highly personal, right? It's not a discussion about funding the military. It's a discussion about my Humvee. It's a discussion about what we got when I was in Iraq, or what we didn't get, or why my weapon didn't work, or those kinds of things are highly personal to people, and it's really, really important to keep that in mind. Because what will happen sometimes is these discussions escalate, and if the veteran is not feeling safe, or if they have some PTSD, sometimes they take it to a level that's probably not okay, or at least not really appropriate for the classroom. And what can end up happening is the instructor or the school responds to that behavior, right? And the next thing you know, the veteran is being disciplined, or they're sent somewhere where they have to talk to someone about their behavior, where an instructor who is more mindful might not let it have gone to that point, might have protected the veteran from that, right? How does this, I'm curious just to take a second here, how those of you who are in those situations, who work with veterans on campuses, does this sound familiar? Do you have these experiences? I'm seeing some nodding. No one's shaking their head at me. Can one person just think an example that's happened in a classroom? Yeah, please.
I had a vet who was taking a sign language class. He is a rehab. And he just wanted to ask a question, and the teacher said, oh, we can't talk now. But he just wanted to ask the question about the homework. Because in his mind, he was thinking, I can't do the homework without getting information from
right.
it. And it exploded.
And then that exploded.
Oh, yes.
And so what could the instructor, so the situation was a veteran who really just needed clarity on the homework. Again, structure, right? When structure is unclear, I'm a terrible professor that way, just like my PowerPoints. I give a curriculum and then I don't follow it, and it makes people really upset. But what can the instructor do or have done, do you think, to make the veteran feel safer and have stopped that behavior from even needing to come forward?
Just to say, talk to me after class or something. She just went, shh.
Shh.
Every time he tried to say something, he'd go back. Shh.
So telling the student to shut up didn't work. Okay, hard to believe. Yeah, I agree. That kind of thing where there's a moment where you say, okay, this student has a particular need, it doesn't seem reasonable to me, but I didn't have that experience. So I can pay attention to their needs in a different way. Would be helpful, yeah.
Obviously, every situation and case is different. I can speak personally from my own experience as a student. I've talked with other veterans and other peers that in these cases, these are real situations that do happen. And for me personally, what gets me is the fact that a lot of times we as veterans, we're not aware of the resources that are available to remedy situations like that. And if anything, I would definitely say that it's worth getting the word to the veterans to utilize these special services, which actually I just got done going through that process.
Right.
And I can't tell you what a relief it is to know that I'm going to have my notes taken for me, textbooks, I can follow along as it's highlighted, all types of remedies for, just dealing with many different obstacles involved in this.
I'm really glad that you said that. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes?
I just want to agree with that, and I had my hand up to say the same thing, but I think the idea is changing the culture of even just the way you're presenting it, like a referral is a bad thing. I mean, if somebody's writing about their nightmares, maybe they do need to get connected to the mental health counseling or to
No.
About
Yeah.
enlightening those of us on the other end of it to recognize it, not be punitive, but then to set up a support network. I think that's kind of a lot.
No, I'm really glad that you said that, because it certainly was not my intention to suggest that referral is a bad thing. Referral is a good thing. Referral is a good thing. In general, you're probably not going to go wrong with referrals. It's also, I would suggest, it's hard to expect students to know what services are available if you don't know what services are available. So knowing what's available for students and where and how to refer is critical. What I would say is the way that you do the referral and what's motivating the referral does go a long way, right? If the referral is, you just scared the crap out of me, so you have to go talk to someone because your essay was really weird, there's a way to say that in a way that makes the veteran feel really normal and supported, and there's a way to say it where the veteran feels like they're being picked on and that people think they're crazy, and that tends not to work. And that's more, but I'm glad you said that, because yes, referrals are a good thing. Don't not refer. Don't get that from this. No clear chain of command. We've talked a little bit about, again, being your own hierarchy. It's not clear to vets. So if you're in the service, especially if you're enlisted, like who do you go to? Vets in here. Who do you go to if you have a problem? Either each other, but if you want to go up the chain, who's the person that decides yes or no? You have an NCO, right? You have a first sergeant. You have somebody who knows the answer to your question. Would you generally agree with that? Yeah, or at least, and their job is to, here it's really difficult to know when you get out of the service, who is the person that knows the answer? And so I had the experience too when I was even just becoming an instructor at a community college. Where do I go to get my key? Okay, where's the photocopy machine? Well, go to this floor. Well, this floor is locked. Where do I get the key for this floor so I can get my key? Right, and so on and so forth. That's the experience that a lot of student veterans have, and there isn't a place. There isn't a first sergeant or an NCO or somebody that will direct you, and so you have to work through that on your own, and that's not that simple. It's not that simple for any of our students, but it's definitely not that simple when what you're used to is there being a very clear map of what you do and where you go for certain things. Yeah.
I find that the certifying official becomes the supposed expert, and then
The catch-all. Yeah.
we have to then become way more educated so we know the next step. And we also get confused in the minds of the veterans as counselors. You need to tell me what.
Can you talk just a little louder?
You need to tell me what classes to take. You need to tell me what I need to do next. And as a veteran myself, I think I am more sympathetic, and I might hold hands a little too much.
Okay. So you can go in the other direction too, of holding hands a little bit too much. But I think maybe you do that because you understand the anxiety that's involved in not having right answers. Right? Largely in the military, there's the right answer and there's everything else. Right? And in life and in education, that's just not the case. Right? You have to make those choices for yourself, and it's not clear necessarily what the right answers are. And people sometimes are looking for that because that's what they're used to. Civilians and new peers. Someone from the student panel mentioned this yesterday, so I'm stealing it. I think a lot of folks, when they get out of the military, feel like their peers are like Bart Simpson. One of the guys yesterday, and again, I apologize to him because he may say this again later, and it's really my bad for stealing it from him, but he said, it drives him insane. He comes to class, and this guy, this 18-year-old in his mind kid, he's 25, but he feels a million years older than this kid. This kid says, dude, did you bring a pencil? And he thinks, yes, idiot, of course I brought a pencil. I'm in class. More importantly, why do you not have, did somebody rob you? What happened to you that you don't have a pencil? Right? And so that experience, like, I'm motivated, I want to be here. Right? Why do you not have the basic things why did you not prepare? Right? Why do you not have change for parking? Those kind of things. And it's very difficult sometimes for guys getting out of the military to relate to that, because it's so different from the way that they've been trained and the way that they've needed to be successful and to be trusted and trustworthy by their peers. When you're deployed and you're in the military, you don't have the luxury of not having a pencil, right? You have to be squared away, because in some cases people's lives depend on it, in some cases your life depends on it. And certainly if you don't get it right, as someone said earlier, there'll be some corrective language, right? Or maybe you'll encounter the deck in some form, okay? And so to come back and see people really laissez-faire, and I was up late, and I didn't really, what's the assignment? What are we supposed, right? That kind of engagement in school is really strange and really sometimes, frankly, upsetting for vets, and as they try to negotiate relationships with people through this. To be aware of that. Campus crowds, obviously, for PTSD and traumatic brain injury, and especially PTSD, there's almost nothing as disturbing or unsettling as a crowd or being in a crowd. Why is that? Particularly if you're thinking about some of the combat that our Iraqi vets and Afghanistan vets have done, where they've gone house to house in some cases. Yeah?
It's exhausting having to surveil everybody and be aware of everyone's presence.
It is absolutely exhausting to survey everyone around you. You have to pay attention to 360 degrees of possible threats. And it can't be done. It's simply, you're going to bump into something, right? Like, you can't do it. It's incredibly disorienting. People don't like it. I had a vet who thought it would be a good idea to go to IKEA on a Saturday with his family. I think that's traumatic for all of us. I suggested that, with PTSD, it just wasn't, go at like 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. Even then, make sure you follow the arrows or else they arrest you or something. But campus crowds are really a problem. And again, like if you're working with veterans, particularly if you know a veteran has PTSD and they're talking about their classes, and you know that there are certain times that the school is really going to be crowded, or there's going to be rush hour, or the parking lot's going to be full, it's really good to have a conversation with them and say, hey, do you want to be at this class at this time? It's really, really crowded. You should know that, right? If that's cool with you, fine. But be aware that this could be what's happening. In the same way, if a veteran comes to you and says, I really don't like, and normally, are you really going to hear a veteran say, I find it highly anxiety-invoking to be in a crowd because it's overstimulating and triggers my post-traumatic stress disorder? Is that the way they'll phrase it? Not unless they've been seeing me for a long time. No. What are they going to say? I don't like crowds. End of explanation. Why not? Because I don't like them. Why don't you like them? I just told you. Because I don't like them. Right? And that's the most that you're going to get. And so again, if you know that the person is a student veteran, and maybe you know they've been deployed, even if you don't know about a diagnosis and you don't want to ask or it's not appropriate, you can maybe infer that this is a person who feels really uncomfortable in that situation because of PTSD or TBI, and you can help them work around that. Okay? Because again, you're not going to get that really articulate explanation. Sometimes you will, but most often you won't. So you have to kind of read between the lines. Crowded classrooms are along with that. Again, veterans tend to like sitting in the back, where they can feel comfortable. So again, as I totally violated this rule earlier today, because when I was beginning this lecture, I went to the back and I said, you all have to move forward. And so that's something you may be thoughtful about as an instructor, or you may say, well, I'd like you to move forward, but I won't make you move forward because there's an idea you may not be comfortable, okay? The same is true when we're talking about assigning group work. Thinking about some classes really want to assign people to work in groups, and that's a good experience. I'm not saying veterans can't do that. Veterans know very well how to work in groups. But for some vets, when we're talking about PTSD in particular, there are a lot of trust issues. It's really complicated to do that. They're not sure how they feel about it, and they don't want to. And so, for good reason. And so again, to be sensitive, when a veteran comes to you and says, I really prefer to work alone, and you know that this person is a veteran, you can read between the lines and hear, I'm incredibly uncomfortable by this, made uncomfortable by this, and asking me to do this may cause me to drop your class. So can we do something else? Again, there's a lot of reading between the lines. Yeah? Yes, it can be. It can be. And so, yes, there's a fine line. That's a great question. The question is, well, can't encouraging a veteran to work in a group be also an opportunity for them to push themselves a little bit and become more comfortable? Yes, the answer is yes. That's possible. On the flip side, if the veteran really pushes back, maybe what they're telling you is, I really can't do this now. Okay? And this will make it very... Now, as an instructor, for example, you might say, well, is the point of this class for them to learn the material, or is the point of this class for them to work in a group? If working in the group is the point of the class, then sure. If it's the material, I would say at least consider offering another possibility, right? Because, again, we're making success possible. And these are ways that veterans will tell us or show us that it's harder for them to be successful. That's one thing that could happen. Standing in line, again, really stressful for veterans. Helping them through that is also possible. It makes the VA really tough sometimes. You have to do a lot of waiting. There's nothing that campuses can do, or not a lot you can do. You have lines. Everyone understands that. But for veterans with PTSD, again, there are people behind you. That's really uncomfortable. What we're often talking about is a state of hyperarousal with PTSD, which means standing in line is just incredibly uncomfortable. You're not going anywhere. You need to be moving. And so, again, when you hear... Now, how will you hear about this? You'll say to a veteran, have you accessed this service, or did you do this? And the veteran might say, well, there was a really long line, and so I booked out of there. I took off. And again, what are they telling, right? And there's a service that they need. There's a service they need. They know they need it. They're not willing to stand in line to get it. Are they really just stubborn, or is there something about standing in that really long line that's really, truly difficult for them? And if you can, again, in those circumstances, deduce or work with them to understand that actually that particular line or standing in that way is really, really tough for them and causes a tremendous amount of anxiety, there may be ways to work around that. Okay? And where you can do that and help them do that, you will go miles in helping build trust with this veteran and helping this veteran to be successful on your campus. Okay? So these are opportunities to try to find wiggle room with veterans so that they can get the services that they need. And again, a lot of it is just listening with the ear of someone who knows something about veterans and someone who knows something about PTSD, because you'll often hear it in some kind of code, right? Like, I can't deal with lines. Well, if you don't stand in line, how are you going to register for classes? I don't know. This is bullshit. I mean, like, that's the kind of thing I might hear, and what really is being said is, I can't handle doing this. It's really difficult for me, right? So working with the veteran to get through that is going to be really helpful. Often. Talked a little bit about this, protests and signs. Dr. Thomas talked about this. Stole it from my presentation, I'm sure. This is obviously just something that really, particularly up in the Bay Area, that gets touched on. The protests and signs, it's the First Amendment. It's good to have them there. Just be really aware that when those things are happening, for veterans, it can be incredibly personal. It can be incredibly hurtful. One community college in the Bay Area, I'm not going to say which one, but it's in Berkeley, has this huge section, or one section, I actually haven't seen it, but veterans have told me about it, of photographs of Abu Ghraib, right, of the scandal of the prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib. Okay? And they're making a statement about human rights, and they're making a statement about the way we treat our enemies, and so on and so forth. Okay, we can argue that that's a legitimate thing to do. My guess is, though, that no one was paying a tremendous amount of attention to how that was interpreted by the veteran community, right? What are you saying? Are you making the statement that all veterans are abusing prisoners? Where are all the photographs that show veterans doing good things and serving our country? Those weren't in the presentation. And so, you know, I really think that the campus, when they put those photographs up, they weren't really thinking about that. I don't think they were deliberately trying to disrespect veterans, but they weren't really aware that I think that that's what they were doing. And they were not only was it taken to be disrespectful, it was taken to be deeply hurtful. And so, again, where there's awareness about those issues, there's an opportunity to do something differently. Not to be so not to be so careful that you can't ever have a conversation about the war. You can't ever have a conversation about things like Abu Ghraib. But just when you do so, to be mindful of how you're doing it and who else is in the room. And really, that's no different. I had someone ask me once, how's that different from other students with diverse backgrounds? It's not. Just as we take diversity classes and we're asked to be aware of all of the diverse backgrounds of the student population and where they've been and what they've been through. We're asking the same thing for our veterans. With an added understanding, as Dr. Natcherson said, that we sent them there, right? And to pay some attention to that, okay? Time tests, I've noticed for the veterans that I talk to, are particularly difficult with PTSD and TBI. Time tests, particularly in rooms where there are lots of people and lots of scratching sounds and people grunting and making test noises. Time tests tend to be a real stressor for students with PTSD. It's not that they don't know the material, but it's harder for them to get to it as fast. And what you'll see sometimes is a student who's in your class regularly, they attend, they participate, they're really motivated, and you'll get a test back from them that's like half finished, right, or a quarter finished. And you think to yourself, okay, what happened here? I know the student knows the material, I read their essay, it was really good. What is going on with the test? And your option is, I can give you an F, or I can give you an opportunity to talk to me, right? And so where, again, you, like with any other student, you have these warning signs with vets that something related to their service might be impeding their success. And that's where you have an opportunity to make that referral or have a conversation about making the referral. Getting services where the student can take the test in another room, right? I had one student come in, suffering from tremendous depression. He was so down, he was doing really poorly. Literally, I'd love to say that I helped him with my brilliant clinical skills. How did I help him? I said, hey, have you talked to TSPS and asked them about taking the test in another room? We can do that? Yes, you can do that. I will write you a note that says you have PTSD, which he did. That was literally it. Pretty much didn't see him again after that. Why? Because he was happy. He was fine. He did well in school. He didn't need me for more than that. So sometimes it's even something as small as that just turns a veteran in a good direction. For time. This comes up a lot. I'm often amazed at how often this comes up. How much it bothers veteran students when people are disrespectful to instructors. And what do I mean by disrespectful? Well, I'll give you an example. As an instructor, this used to not happen when, at least some time ago when I was a student. I would get emails from students. Dude, what's the assignment? Right? Like that would, for example, be disrespectful, I think, to a veteran. So talking to the professor like they're your friend, Facebooking, textbooking, Twittering, I don't know, all these, tweeting, right? Tweeting. All these kinds of things, not coming on time, arguing with the professor, and so on and so forth, are actually impediments to learning not only for those students, but particularly for student veterans who take that really personally, right? Even if they don't like the professor. Right? Salute the rank, if not the person. And I think instructors have an opportunity, not only for their own self-respect, but also for those in the class to say, this kind of behavior is tolerated and this kind of behavior is not tolerated. Because it really stops, particularly as student veterans, it really stops them from learning in some ways, and to pay attention to that. Now, that doesn't mean that no one should ever disagree with an instructor, or that you have to hold your classroom like elementary school, but to pay attention that when those things happen, it's actually influencing the other students, particularly our veterans. You'll hear the folks on the student panel talk about that. Managing GI Bill questions, this comes up a lot. Hopefully at each campus there's someone that really understands all of this. Managing the GI Bill, I think we could say, is not always that simple. It's a real stress for veterans trying to work out their benefits, trying to plan out their academic career in a way that maximizes their benefits. There's a fair amount to be done there. And not to say that you all need to be experts in that. I'm certainly not. I'm definitely guilty of saying things like, wow, that sounds really complicated. Let's talk about how you feel. And then referring them to someone who actually knows it better. So I'm guilty of that. But to be aware that it is really complicated. That it's not just like someone comes to your house and says, here's your GI Bill free credit card for going to school. Just flash this and you'll get everything you want. It's a lot more complicated than that. And helping veterans connect to people who do know the answer can be really helpful because it's tough. We talked a little bit about this. I'll just touch on this because the professor actually said this. You'd have to be a complete idiot to join the Army these days. Just be careful. You're allowed to have that opinion. Be thoughtful about how that comes across. Okay? All right. as well as I can talk about this stuff, I think the following, I'm laughing. Has anyone seen it? I'm laughing because this next little video clip, I think, really exemplifies what I'm talking about. That being said, here's an advisory. It was made by an OIF veteran. It's on YouTube. You can find it. The dialogue contains naughty words. Okay? Feel free to excuse yourself if you don't like hearing naughty words. It comes from, I think it's close to 2008, 2009, 2010, when the war was in a slightly different stage. I think that it really captures one way that a lot of veteran students feel in terms of relating to their fellow students. All right, let's see if it's loud enough.
So you are a Iraq War veteran?
Yes, I am.
I support the troops, but I am against the war.
I understand how you feel. I do not like the wars, plural either.
But the Iraq War is over.
The Iraq War is not over. There are still 50,000 U.S. service members still in Iraq, and many have been killed since the so-called combat forces have left.
But I saw on the news that the Iraq War is over.
You are mistaken. Even if the United States and other coalition forces leave completely, there will still be violence. Anyway, how do you support the troops?
I have a yellow ribbon on the back of my car.
Putting a bumper sticker on your car does not mean you support the troops.
And I like the United States Marine Corps on my Facebook page.
That is completely irrelevant. How much do you actually know about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I know a lot. I am a political science major, and I studied abroad in Italy for a semester. I know a lot about the world.
Can you tell me the difference between a Sunni and Shiite Muslim?
I do not know what that is.
Can you tell me what ethnic group in Afghanistan the Taliban are a part of?
The terrorist group.
Can you tell me what an IED is?
My friend Jennifer went to the Jersey Shore last summer, and she had to take antibiotics for a wicked bad IED.
That is completely foul. I think you may be confusing an IED with something else.
Is that a new iPhone app?
No.
Oh wait. I think I saw that on Cake Boss last week. Is it a type of dessert?
No. It is not.
Can I get it on Netflix?
I hope so. Do you know what an RPG is?
Yes. They are for nerds who can't get any pussy. I am against the war, but support troops.
Again. You have clearly demonstrated that you don't actually know why war is a bad thing. You are just going along with what everybody else says without giving it much thought. You might not actually support the troops, but say so, because it is the politically correct thing to say today.
But I am a political science major, and I have studied abroad.
You are wasting your parents' money by pursuing a nearly worthless degree, and by visiting a first world Western European country, so you can drink underage and visit museums that you're not even interested in anyway.
But I have learned about the world, and I'm against the war, but support the troops.
How have you supported the troops?
I pay taxes.
Your tax dollars are not going towards funding these wars. The defense budget is propped up with foreign debt. Essentially, the People's Republic of China is financing the war on terror at an exorbitant interest rate. You and I are going to be paying for these wars long after the people who started them are dead.
OMG, that is like totally not cool. My dad is a lawyer. I'm going to text him to tell him that this is wrong, and that he must do something about it.
Did you vote in the last election?
Yes. I voted for President Obama.
November 2, 2010 was the last election, which was a midterm election. The presidential election was in 2008. You did not vote in the last election.
I am a political science major, and I have studied abroad.
Have you written to your congressman or woman or senator about the issues that bother you?
I did not know you could do that.
Have you donated any money to any veterans organizations?
No, I am way uber busy.
Would you ever consider joining the military?
No. The military is for poor and uneducated people.
You are wrong. 97% of the armed forces have high school diplomas. Also, young people from the middle and upper middle classes are overrepresented in recruitment demographics, and nearly 75% of Americans are unfit for military service due to a variety of reasons, and not all make it through recruit training. It is actually harder to join the military than it is to get into college.
I do not believe you. I go to college because I am smart. I am a political science major and have studied abroad.
Besides me, have you actually talked to any Iraq and Afghanistan veterans?
No. I saw on the news that you all have PTSD and are crazy.
You can't be this fucking stupid.
OMG, I have to go. My BFF Madison is texting me. We are going out clubbing tonight. TTYL.
I think I could probably just show that. So, you know, I think, again, not for every veteran, you'll be able to ask the students in the panel, but I really think that video, I think that clip really just captures some essence of how a lot of student veterans feel in terms of relating to their peers. And that, as with him, the character on the clip, there's just a lot of irritation, a sense of not really being understood, of people not taking for granted what it is that they've done, taking for granted that their opinions are educated when the vet feels like the opinions are not educated, and so on and so forth. So I would really like to talk to some of the student veterans when they come up and ask them, that's during question time, if this is something that they could relate to. But I think this captures it really well. So just a couple more things before we close today. In terms of talking to veterans, so, you know, sometimes what happens is instructors or people on campus will tell me, well, I don't know what to say. I want to engage veterans, but I don't know how. What are the rules? What can I say? What can I not say? Here's some good ways to start. Some good ways to start are, what did you do in the military? Where did you go, right? Not without making an assumption that the person deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, or even that they deployed at all. Maybe they deployed 5 times, maybe they didn't deploy. How are you and your family doing? Can't really go wrong with that. Okay, there's nothing too stressful about it. They may give you a stressful answer, but those are some really good ways to start a conversation with the veteran. Okay? Here's some questions that you may not want to ask, that I'm going to recommend you don't ask. Pressuring a veteran regarding specifics about their service, either in person or in a classroom setting or in a group setting. Dr. Tons talked about earlier, it's really puts the veteran on the spot. They may actually answer you. You may get a detailed answer, and then it may not be okay with them afterwards. So be really thoughtful about how to do that. In fact, sometimes, and there's a fine line here, a veteran will actually start to share, and you may start to get a feeling like they may be sharing more than they want to right now. And I actually would like to suggest, if you're in that position, either in a counseling session or you're in a classroom setting or anywhere else, if you're in that position and you feel like, wait a minute, this veteran may be spilling out more than they're ready to do or more than the group can handle, it may actually not be a bad idea to kind of gently redirect. Okay? And you don't want to say, you need to stop talking about that, right? Obviously, that's a bad thing to do, but it's not always a good thing, even if the veteran looks like they want to talk, to let them go into details, because afterwards it's not always a very safe feeling. So again, it's a fine line. There's no rule about that, but it's something to consider when you have veterans start talking about their experiences. Minimize the challenges. We've talked almost entirely about that, about all these different things that we can do to help veterans be more successful. Really important not to make assumptions about the veterans' political or foreign policy views. Veterans have a wide range of foreign policy views and political views just like the rest of us. It's not impossible, for example, or that unlikely, that a veteran might have real critiques about the military and real critiques about how they thought the war was run or whether they thought we should have had the war, and also be incredibly proud of their service and would tell you in a heartbeat, I would do it again. I'd go tomorrow if I was asked. Right? Those two things are not contradictory. For some of us who haven't served in the military, it sounds, how could that both be true? You have a TBI and you've had all this trouble. You want to go back? Yes. You didn't agree with the war? No. But you want to go back? Yes. Right? All of those things can be true at the same time, so it's important for us not to make assumptions. That's a good question not to ask, okay? Particularly if you don't know the person very well. Because what does it mean to say the war isn't worth it? There's some really deep meanings to that. If we say, well, it wasn't worth it, what does that mean for our own sacrifices of our friends? Right? So that's not a very simple question to ask. The answer isn't very simple, and it's a really personal question to ask. So again, I wouldn't ask it. If you hear another student asking a veteran that, you may want to jump in if there's a way to do that and redirect. Okay? Here's some other good ones. It's amazing how often, because we know not to do it, if you talk to a lot of student veterans, it's amazing how often they still get asked these kind of questions. Did you kill someone? Are you crazy? What did you think of the war? How did you get out of going, right? You talk to a veteran that deployed to Alaska or they deployed to Japan instead of deploying to Iraq. You say to them, well, how did you get out of going to Iraq? Right? Not a very polite thing to ask. Okay, it implies that the veteran somehow did something to shirk his or her duty. That's very likely not the case. You go where you're told to go in the military, and you do it right away. So it's really important not to make assumptions like that. Good thing you didn't see combat, right? So someone might tell you, well, what did I do in the military? What did you do in the military? I was a mechanic. Oh, well, it's good you weren't in combat. Well, do you know that the person wasn't in combat? You know, often I talk to veterans whose MOS or job was something like mechanic. That's what they were trained for and spent half of their tour clearing houses, right? Or they were a mechanic, but where were they a mechanic? They were flown to areas or dropped in areas or had to go in convoys to areas that were incredibly dangerous. Or the place where they were doing their work was incredibly dangerous because it was getting mortared all the time, taking in rocket fire. So it's not, again, we have to be really careful about making assumptions when people tell us, oh, I did this or I did that in the military, okay? Again, at least you were only a cook, a mechanic, and so forth. It's really demeaning. It can be, depending on what you did do, really offensive. So let's just be careful about it. Some recommendations. I'm going to go through these really quickly because we've covered most of them and it's time. Maintain awareness, we've talked about. More awareness you have, the easier it will be for you to notice when things are not going according to plan for the veteran and ways that you can find some areas that they can improve or that things can be done differently, whether it's a referral, whether it's making allowances on assignments, and so forth. Recognize at least the anniversary dates that you know about. You don't know about all of their personal anniversary dates or alive days, but at least you know things like July 4th, Veterans Day, Memorial Day, things like that are going to be days for some veterans where there may be some added stress. So know about that. Avoid putting the veteran on the spot, we talked about. Include welcoming text in your syllabus. I have an example of that in your packets. I'll have it up here in a second. But including welcoming text in your syllabus lets the veteran know that there are veterans in the class and that you are amenable to hearing what challenges they have and working with them to find solutions. Be flexible, we talked about. Be respectful is a given. I'm not going to read it now. It's all in your packets. But basically, this is letting veterans know, I know you're here. I'm here to help. Okay? Refer for treatment. See, I told you I wasn't dissing that. Refer for treatment and assessment whenever possible, whether that's on your own campus or a vet center or a VA, or as Dr. Nutchinson was talking about, to a nonprofit or somewhere else, anywhere that you know about where assessment and treatment you think is effective, especially if you have personal contacts, is a good thing. Encourage involvement. And again, this goes back to the group question, where you think you can get a veteran involved, if you have a personal relationship with a veteran, and you can get them out of some isolation, out of the smallness of either PTSD or just not connecting. You can help them find things that they can do on campus to feel more involved, whether it's going to the poetry class or joining a sports team or participating in some group or going to the Veterans Resource Center, whatever it is. If you can find ways to help veterans get engaged on your campus and with each other, you are helping, right? And if you have a personal relationship with a veteran and they trust you, you have a tremendous opportunity to do that, to help them re-engage in their lives, re-engage in their studies, and feel less isolated, feel less like, I was reading somewhere, the true 1%, right, of this country. Talk about the 99% and the 1%. One way to think about the military today is that's the 1%. Right, to help them feel part of the community. Some last thoughts. As some other folks have talked about earlier, it's important to remember that even with the challenges that veterans face coming to your campuses, they bring a tremendous amount of plus to your campus, including years of resiliency and strength that have been brought up, alternative perspectives, alternative lifestyles, ways of thinking, diversity, tremendous amount of diversity on your campus that veterans bring, motivation, determination, leadership, and maturity. Those are just some of the ways that veterans contribute to your campuses. Remember that more than any of the other stuff that I've talked about today. If you walk away just remembering that veterans bring tremendous bonus and plus to your campus, I think you've accomplished something today. If you don't know what to say to a veteran, if you're not sure, if you didn't listen to anything that I said today because you were tired and it was after lunch, if you're not sure what to say to a veteran, just say welcome home. Okay. Thank you, everybody.